So I'd like to welcome the folks who are online who are joining us. We just had our prayer and we're going to get underway. We are a little over halfway through the Confessions of the Presbyterian Church. Today we're going to be talking about really what would be kind of the magnum opus, the Hey Jude of the Book of Confessions. It's the Westminster Confession of Faith. It is the one that, while there are other confessions, this is the one that is kind of universally held. So it doesn't matter if you are in a progressive branch of the Presbyterian Church, if you are in a really conservative, old school, hardline branch, the Westminster Confession of Faith is going to be central. And the idea of it adding extra confessions to beyond Westminster was part of the split that happened in the Southern Church in the 1960s and 1970s. So that was what we will be talking about in a few weeks, the Confession of 1967. But the idea was that some folks hold to this standard so highly that they do not believe there needs to be any more jots, any more tittles, anything more beyond this. So we're going to talk about that here in a second. But as we get underway, are there any questions about the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Second Helvetic, the Scots Confession? Come on. That's okay. Okay. So we'll go ahead a little bit. Does anybody need to, actually, we have to do our affirmation of faith, but you know what? I'm going to do this. I'm going to turn right back because you all should know this by now. What is our chief end? Our chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy God forever. You will see if you have a book of confessions, and again, I've got extra copies up here, so whomever might need one. You bet. There you go. All right. If you look actually at what it says here, that's what we affirm in our church is slightly different. Because I just thought it takes like changing two words to make it inclusive of everybody. So in the shorter catechism, it is, what is the chief end of man? Man's chief end. And it is one of those interesting things because in the end, words matter. How we use our words matter. When I was growing up, when I was in church, it was always confusing to me because mankind, or I would say men, or that language. And the Sunday school teacher would always say, well, that just means everybody. And then when I got to seminary, you couldn't say mankind. One giant leap. Yeah, you couldn't say that either. But you'd say humankind. Wasn't that? At first, it was like this is so weird, and now it's so weird for me not to do it. But it's a lot of the stuff is just what we're used to, or what we grow up with, and then we hold on to it just because that's what we're used to. At least that's my assessment. But the whole point too is when it says man, is it talking about a singular man, a singular human, or is it talking about everybody? Yeah. He flubbed his line. A glitch. Yeah. Yes. That. You still think there's an A? You think it might be. I will say, did you all know that communion has been celebrated on the moon? This is neither here nor there, but it was. Do you know who did it? It's a person who is an elder in the Presbyterian Church. It was Buzz Aldrin. I think member, and again, I guess one of my dear friends from seminary is a huge Aggie fan, and so I don't want to give him too many more flowers after yesterday. But I believe he's was a member. He was down at like the Presbyterian Church in Brand. But yeah, so he had brought up a little thing to have communion celebrated on the moon. So it's not really that important. And the other thing, since we're mentioning famous Presbyterians, John Glenn, also Presbyterian. So what's that? Little data. See, this is why you come here. It's like I want to learn, but now I realize that I don't know that there's ever going to be. I know they did the movie a while back about hidden figures, right? I don't know if they'll do anything about the Presbyterian, uh, you know, astronauts or not. But we'll jump into the banners, and I lost my cheat sheet, so some of you might have to help me by looking into the back of your books of confessions. But we've got Nicene, we've got Apostles, we've got the Scots, the Second Helvetic, or excuse me, the Scots and Heidelberg, and then Second Helvetic, and then we've got Westminster. So, some of you who can look at the back, you guys can cheat if you want to, but what do we see on the Westminster banner? It's not as well. It's in the eye of the beholder, right? You got the Alpha and the Omega, which is like the beginning and the end. I am the Alpha, I am the Omega. God, Jesus says, I'm the first and the last, the beginning and the end. It's the A to Z of that. What else do we see? You got the eye. Yes, you've got not of Sauron. For well, a few of you were like, okay, I get. Well, look. Well, see here. Here it is, and that's part of the question about uh, the stuff that's like the weird stuff that when you actually look at a dollar bill, and you're like, what in the world? Do you remember the first time you looked at a dollar bill closely, and you're like, what kind of stuff is this? You realize like most of that stuff is because of Freemasonry, and uh, like I knew plenty of Masons over my life, and there were just a lot of Presbyterians who were Masons. There was like a big backlash against Masons, like this fear that it was a cult or it was this or that. But you get some of the imagery that the all-seeing eye. Well, they didn't come up with it. It's here. So what is the eye in the middle of? A triangle. Well, when we see triangles as Presbyterians, as Christians, what does that mean? Trinitarian. Yep. I think in the dollar bill, it's at the top of is it at the top of a pyramid? Yeah. And so the eye essentially, it might say better articulated in the book, but it's about what God sees. But does anybody have yeah? That's it. And so it is, and that's one of the things, the big thing about Westminster is it really truly affirms God's providence, that God is in charge. Uh, so then, sitting on a Bible or a book. Yep. I would guess it is. I believe that is the Bible, and what I tell children, I tell youth, I tell adults, why are Bibles like parachutes? They don't work if they're not open. So they work a lot better when they're open. So at the top, what do we see? A crown. Because this is not just providence, this is sovereignty. It is emphasizing the sovereignty of God, that there is no God but God. Other, there's probably an issue regarding the colors here, but anything else that's said here that you all see in your cheat sheets in your books? Doesn't have the banners? That is weird. Because even like the cheap ones they gave us, the generic ones do. So you also there are three crosses though that are right there, and that it is a there's their own its own triangle there as well. Because there's a triangle going up and there's a triangle going down as well. So one of the things I want to talk about, because today we're going to talk mainly here in a moment, talking about a concept that is known in Calvinism as TULIP, T.U.L.I.P, and I brought handouts, so that's exciting. But it's a question when we talk about God's providence, and a lot of people misunderstand what that means. I've had people try to explain providence as foreknowledge. God knows what decisions you're going to make. Well, of course, if God knows everything, then God will know that. But it is not foreknowledge. It is that since God already foreknew all these things, if you go to Romans chapter 8, it says those who God foreknew, he also predestined. And so we're going to talk a little about predestination, and probably a lot about this, but this is at the hallmark, or this is at the core of a lot of things that are affirmed in the Westminster Confession of Faith and what is traditionally associated with Calvinism. When I was younger, I would say, well, that if you hear that person's a Calvinist, you're just like, oh, it's predestination. And realizing there's a lot more to it than that. It's one of the reasons I became Presbyterian as an adult, is because it made sense to me there. So any questions here? Because I also want to say, and I've made this stupid joke before, it's not hyper-Calvinism. You know, hyper-Calvinism, some people think it's pastors had too much coffee. It's not it. But I am hyper ADHD Calvinism. And hyper Calvinism is the idea that God controls everything in the sense that he's forcing you to do things. That you are just, that it's he's working the puppet strings. That there are people who believe that, and frankly, that's terrifying. Because you have to bend all the stuff in order for it to fit your narrative. An example of that, this is not my notes, but I think for me it's worth noting, is while not a Calvinist per se, you all remember Pat Robertson, 700 Club. He when I was still in Alabama, so it would have been maybe around 2008, 2009, there was that awful earthquake in Haiti. And Haiti's never had anything. It's like we'd go do mission work in Dominican Republic, and then we'd see like Haitians that were over there in the DR, a poor country, because it had more opportunities than Haiti. It's just brutal. And Pat Robertson got on, basic cable television and said this was punishment for their revolts against the French 200 years earlier, and for some kind of voodoo or some type of thing about some indigenous religion type thing. And it's like, wow. A few years later, when the tornado hit Joplin, should we say that was because Joplin allowed brothels and saloons during its mining days? Because how we have to be so careful of how it's a lot easier to point fingers at somebody else than to do it. And then when you do actually have to do that, that's when things just crumble. We got to be really careful about the idea of hyper Calvinism, that God's doing that. But to circle back, just the best way, and this is part of my doctoral work, the best way I can describe with natural disasters, and I think certainly there are things that we can do to be better stewards of the earth and to lessen the risk. They're always going to be there. But literally the world's broken. Current plates don't line up. You know, you go, when I was in high school, 1988, I don't know if you all remember this, but there was this huge fear that we were getting ready for another huge New Madrid earthquake. It was 88 or 89, but I was in high school and everyone's like, and people are wearing these shirts saying it's our fault. uh, the world is literally broken. And so these things are bound to happen. So, any questions there? I just want to make sure. Yeah, John. Well, to quote the church lady, isn't that special? Uh, it was in a range of time, and there was actually something like a couple years later, but it was relatively minor. But uh, but every few years there's some radio or now internet preacher who will say, "I've done the math that the end of the world is next Tuesday," and uh, in fact, there was one like in this last maybe about a month ago, 2 months ago. There was a talk about the rapture. Okay, now you got me on a rabbit trail, but we're going down it together. Uh, you know where when the concept of the rapture came up? It's not in the Bible. It's maybe 200. It's an American invention. Yeah, yeah. It's the idea. And they talk about pre-tribulation, post-tribulation, all that kind of stuff regarding the Jesus 1,000-year reign, and all the stuff from Revelation. The idea of actual rapture, it really is not biblical. There's one line, it's either First or Second Peter, where it talks about how um, we'll be lifted up, and I'll find that it's really neither here nor there, but it is important to note. Like, if you poll the average American and you said, "Will there who claims Christianity, will there be a rapture?" They'll probably say yes, but it is not. It is not. It is not historic orthodoxy of the church. Mhm. 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 Yeah. Well, and yeah. So the parousia, it's that might be a class at some point worth discussing. Is just call it the end, and talk about all the things that how we've understood it, what we've got right, what we've got wrong in the church. But again, confessional documents are under the authority of Scripture, and Scripture just does not say this. A lot of things that we will put our own stuff on Scripture without understanding what Scripture was actually saying. And even the idea of, like, for instance, Jesus entering into Jerusalem. And we're like, well, he's riding a colt of a donkey. It's like, is it that big of a deal? Well, every time a Roman emperor, a Roman general, they conquered Gaul. What did they do? They had a parade. And they rode in with a throng of soldiers, right? And they were on the best steeds, Right. And so you have Jesus who, if you don't understand that, you don't understand what Jesus is doing. He's giving an alternative. He's riding in on a colt, not like a big, beautiful horse, and of a donkey. And they're waving palm branches as opposed to swords. And so, mhm. Yep, yeah. Which but all context matters, and understand all those things. So we have this. I'm not going to get too far in the weeds on the history of the Westminster Confession of Faith. There was a time where there was a thought that England might eschew Episcopalianism, eschew uh, being Anglican, and there was the hope that it would become Reformed. And so this is kind of this period uh, with the Westminster Confession of Faith. Some of you remember Oliver Cromwell, and so there was this idea of the Puritans and these ties to Calvinism, and so in some ways the return to the monarchy was also a return to Anglicanism. But so Westminster, that was written over the course of 5 years, 5 or 6 years, with the purpose of saying this will be a statement of faith for all of they're hoping for all of England and all of its territories, and that would grow from there. It's still important with the Presbyterians, but obviously we still have work to do with the English to get them become Reformed. So you've got the Confession of Faith. You've got also two other documents that are part of this. There's the Confession of Faith, there's the longer catechism, and there's the shorter catechism. Does anyone want to guess who the longer catechism is for and who the shorter catechism is for? Longer for adults, yes. Or for those who have been in the faith for a while. Shorter for youth, for new believers, but it's much more. In some ways, we talked about the difference between like the Heidelberg Catechism and the Second Helvetic. Well, the Second Helvetic Confession was much more for the training of seminarians or for pastors. So the longer, it kind of makes sense, right? It's more in depth. There's more to it. The shorter catechism is much more to be memorized. Yeah. Fully. Yeah, fully. Well, at least they didn't split the infinitive and said to fully enjoy, because that's the part that you split infinitives, you require a lot of grace from me. For that, as soon as I said Cromwell, I was hoping nobody would ask that question. It, yeah. Mhm. So I, I, if somebody would be so bold to look at the, yeah, and that's where what I was thinking too. And it was one of those things where I thought about this on Tuesday, and then I was like, I need to look that up, and I didn't. And then so that I don't know. So if anybody online wants to, uh, yeah, yeah. It's so talking a little bit about the Charles the First, Charles the Second, Oliver Cromwell, and the loss of heads. living and dead. Yeah, which is interesting because England went through that a couple hundred years before the French did, right? Because like you look at the French, if you ever study the French history and the French Revolution, and then it's just back and forth, and just like I remember the first time I saw Les Miserables, and I thought, oh, this was from. I'm like, I did not even understand that it was in the 1800s because of I thought it was the original French Revolution. So, and oddly enough, with all those things, especially once you get to the French, all those things are tied to America, but that's neither here nor there. Tulip. So, this is where we will spend a fair amount of time. One, I'll just walk around. No, we got plenty. So, so this is an acronym that, especially if you are old, I got extras. I'm just saying. This is an acronym with TULIP that I was not familiar, of which I was not familiar until I got to seminary. And professors would just throw it around as if we all knew what it meant. Did any of you all grow up learning about the acronym TULIP? So this is like historic, kind of old school, like hardline Calvinism. Is really ascribes to the word tulip. They'll say, I am a tulip Presbyterian. And so we'll go through this, and a lot of this gets lumped back into the Westminster Confession, because one of the things that the Westminster Confession really lifts up and really affirms is God's sovereignty and God's providence. And that means that God has a plan, God gets what God wants, that God is in charge. That in the balance that is between free will and God's choice always wins. I affirm that historically, Presbyterians have said this is like the core of what we believe. Now, the question of predestination is a part of that, but it is not the only part of that. So when we reduce, when I was a kid, or when I was in high school, and we would spend, my dad would teach at First and Calvary in Springfield, the Presbyterian Church, once a year for a month. And the way he described it, going from the Methodist Church to the Presbyterian Church, is that Presbyterians were stodgy Methodists who believed in predestination. Like, because the Methodists might be better clappers, no offense. At least my Methodist church growing up, but they believe in predestination. Well, really, it's God's providence in understanding what election means, predestination means, in light of that. Because if you are affirming that it's God's choice and it's God's will, like that's the ultimate thing we're leaning on, and of course this is scriptural, we believe, then naturally the question about eternal salvation is in God's hands, it's not in ours. And for some people, that's really scary. I think it's the best thing around. Because it means, like, if we believe in a loving God, if we affirm that God so loved the world that he sent his only son, that anyone who believed in him would not perish but would have eternal life. If we really affirm that, if it's really outside of our hands, then we are saying that it's in the hands of a God who made us, a God who redeems us, a God who sustains us, and a God who is always with us. Romans 8, we talked about, where it says, those who God foreknew, he also predestined, and those he predestined, he also called to be conformed to the likeness of his son. Later on, it says, it's right after that passage, I just paraphrase, it says, what then shall separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ? hardship or peril or nakedness or famine or the sword. And it says, no, I believe in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither height nor depth, uh, uh, things past, present, things to come, uh, basically, not even death is going to separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. So if we are affirming that, it takes the choice out of our hands, puts it into God's, but we believe, frankly, God's far more gracious than we are. But it's a difficult sell sometimes in America. Because in America, we have the idea of choice, or at least the myth of choice. When I was a kid, they had the Pepsi Challenge. Do you all remember the Pepsi Challenge? You go to the grocery store, the supermarket, the mall, and there'd be somebody out there in a cool T-shirt. They would have a little box, and they'd be like, "Which one?" You know, you can't see what you're drinking, but you had the illusion of choice. In Burger King, have it your way. Yeah. So if it's choice or it's the illusion of choice, we are told we can do anything we want. We can be anything we want it to be. Well, I wanted to be John Tudor when I was a kid. You know, I wanted to be a pitcher for the St. Louis Cardinals. The St. Louis Cardinals don't have much need for a person who has a 67-mile-per-hour fastball. I can do batting practice, right? So it's the illusion, a little bit of choice. So TULIP is something, a jumping off point to talk about. The first part is, yeah.
So when you say that about the illusion of choice, is that an American? It's certainly an American concept, but is that a more Western? Is that in Western civilization like Europe, or do you think it's more American? And you know.
No, I get it. So the question is it American? Is it Western? I think it's in a lot of ways it's uniquely American. And that's me, and that's not even Pastor Dave. That's just Dave. And the reason I say this is because the idea of sovereignty, someone having sovereignty over us, even if it's God, in that we don't have that control. If you are in Europe, even Western Europe, your other parts, you know that in many ways you do not have like legitimate choices, or even sometimes the illusion of choices. You do what the one above you says. And so I think in America, uh, sometimes why I would say the it's not Arminian, it's Armenian, it's Arminianism, where it's talking much more about our choice. That is much more palatable to the masses. It's much more. You're used to it because you can choose between Coke and Pepsi. You can choose between maybe even RC Cola, and you'd be the one only. You know, RC. I don't know who buys RC Cola. It's actually not bad, but uh, but there's Royal Crown. Come on. But the idea is that you get choices all throughout your life. So you want to have choice. You've had this idea like I should have a choice, like I should be able to choose to go to heaven. In other places where you don't have as much control, uh, the Reformed understanding of God's sovereignty is much more just naturally understood, or can be. Yeah, John. Yeah, I think we agree that Americans mm. Look at where the church by saying you have to choose my interpretation. Yeah. So I mean, it's like a lot of yeah. Yeah. And I think the challenge is where you're saying if you want to be saved, that you have to say yes or to accept my version of Christianity in order to be let in. And again, when you're relying on God's sovereignty, it means you don't have to worry about that. that's ultimately God's choice. So let's total depravity. You got your handouts. Total depravity. It's a thing, and we. I'll use my dad. And when I was growing up, my dad, when we were getting ready for his funeral, the boys were talking, and Sunday morning on TV is always Davy and Goliath, and there was a smell of shoe polish. Have the newspaper set out, have the shoe polish. What Sunday morning smelled like. Dad was in a 3-piece suit. We'd go to church. Mom just implored us on the way to church, just be good for 3 hours. Just be good, and I'll give you the whole rest of the day to be bad, but just be good for 3 hours. We'd do that. We'd get home, would have lunch, and then Dad's favorite thing was to get down. And we lived on a farm, and he had a white tank top undershirt, and he had his underwear. It was neither boxers, or boxer briefs. He would just go out in his underwear and go work in the garden. And Dad loved doing that. And I thought about the contrast between the shoes that had to be perfect, in the 3-piece suit, and you come home and you're like, I can be unfettered by that. And I think sometimes we have this idea that we know we're depraved, but it's not total. Yeah, I made a few mistakes here, and we have far less tolerance for people who sin differently than us, because we have this idea that, well, God forgives my sins, yours that are different, maybe not so much. And the first thing to accept with TULIP is that it is total depravity. That power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. Totally. So total depravity. Then we get to unconditional election. And it means God does not choose Gary and elect Gary because God says, you know what? I know Gary's going to make some good. I know he's totally depraved, but he's going to make some good decisions in life, so I'm going to choose him. God says, I choose Gary because I choose Gary. It is God's choice. It's not that Jesus loves the world, but I'm his favorite. It is that God chooses because it pleases God to do so. And again, this is scriptural. There's some references in there. There'll be some other cross references. So unconditional election, limited atonement. This is the question of securing particular redemption. So limited atonement means that, and this is the part where this is the debate, where if everybody is totally depraved and it's God's choice, and God out of 100 people saves 99, is God being gracious? Of course. God didn't have to save any of them. And so part of the reason that limited atonement is debated is because if God chooses to save some who are dying in their sins and not others, is that what's known as double predestination. If God saves one, God's gracious because none of us deserve it. If God saves almost everyone, and this is also part of the reason why you could have two people who say they're twins or they're siblings and they are raised with the same thing, and one of them says yes, and wants to be in that connection with the divine, and the other one completely rejects it. The part of it's like, why is that so? This is the one part of TULIP that gets the most pushback. And the question of how limited and unlimited it is. The I is it's irresistible grace. So, Deb, if God says yes to you, and you can say no to God, your no doesn't matter. It means that grace is irresistible. It's Robert Palmer. You all remember Robert Palmer? The Simply Irresistible, late 80s. Very good music video to that, but it means simply irresistible. It means that, in fact, a buddy of mine, he's the PCA pastor, Presbyterian Church in America, a little more conservative branch in Joplin, is one of my closest friends down there. He got me a picture or a T-shirt with a picture of Calvin on it, and underneath it says "Simply Irresistible." And it's like it's like perfect. Like there's 1% of the world will get this, but I'm like chef's kiss. Uh, and the last part is perseverance of the saints. It means that you don't fall away. If you grew up in a tradition that talked about backsliding, I know Victoria's over there going, yeah, I know that. And John's like backs. You grow up in some of these things, Southern Baptists would talk about a lot. Non-denominational churches talk about it a lot. They talk about it in some strands of the Methodist Church, but we don't ever talk about it here because backsliding from what? And what happens to that kid who committed at camp when they were in 6th grade? They gave their life to Christ, and they're on the straight and narrow, and darn it, now he's out drinking in high school. He's backsliding. He's backsliding. And that question is are you really saved? Can you be saved, and then can you lose your salvation? The perseverance of the saints says, of course you can't lose your salvation, because is God's yes enough? If God says yes, that is enough. T.U.L.I.P has its problems, and it does, but it is a reminder that it is God's choice. Now, Westminster talks about a whole lot more than that, and we could go through the different sections on this, but really it is held up for, half a millennia almost with, or 400 years, whatever it was, on because it is lifting up the uniqueness of our faith, which is that God's in charge. So questions here. No questions? Yeah, Bruce.
So Moses goes up on the mountain. Mm-hmm. He gets the rules. It seems like the rules aren't as important. It seems like God could do what God wants to do. You know what?
Always. Well, why did God? So if you mentioned Moses, we can certainly talk about that, because the one thing that I didn't talk about that I meant to was covenantal theology. At the core of the Presbyterian Church, at the core of Westminster, is the elevation of covenantal theology, that God makes covenants with individuals or with groups of people, and God keeps them. So even before Moses, it's like, why did God choose Abraham? Because it pleased God, right? And Abraham, who was already chosen, it says Abraham believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. That is huge. In Paul talks about this later on, about when he's talking about being saved by grace through faith. So God is the one who says, Abraham, I choose you, and through you, you're going to have a great nation. And through that nation, all other nations will be blessed. God made the choice for Abraham, right? And Abraham made the choice to respond in faith by his belief. The question when it comes kind of fast forwarding to the 10 Commandments, or fast forwarding to the law, it is, we do not do the law to get God to love us. We do the law as a response because God already loves us. And so this changes the dynamic from a God who is punitive, a God who is a vice principal at Parkview High School. Never mind. To the folks online, I'm kind of joking, but that was always the role of the vice principal, right? It was like there was one who's like the head principal kind of be above it, but you needed, it's like you need the enforcer. And so a lot of people look at God like that, like God's going to punish me if I don't do this. it's also, that's terrible toxic theology. The idea is that something bad happens and then you blame it on God or you blame it on yourself, something that you did or left undone. But if you're always worried that you are going to be punished, or you're worried that the only reason you're doing things the right way as you perceive them is because you don't want to be punished, that's a pretty rotten way to go through life. But on the other side, where you say, I have been forgiven, I have been redeemed, my name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life, and actually the blood of Christ, the blood of the Lamb. It is not invisible ink. It is not something that can be erased. That has been done, and so now, fully believing that, I can do the law with joy. Now, the other side of that is an extreme thing where someone says, "Wasn't them already been redeemed? I can do whatever I want." Well, that just means that's not freedom. That's selfishness. That's childish. That's, you know, uh, uh, I was I've been in Columbia this weekend, and we're talking with the kids, and I say, sometimes all I want to hear from you is the two words, "Thank you." Right? I just want to hear thank you. And that's the thing, and I think that's what my parents wanted to hear. It's not this or that. Just see what we did and say thank you. That's the relation. Yeah, Bruce.
So I grew up in a Presbyterian church. Reverend Rose, who was my first pastor, um, he was God was not a loving God.
Mm-hmm.
God was, if you did this, you're going to hell. So it was a hell and brimstone type of experience. So the idea that God is a loving God, not a punitive God, is a relatively new experience.
Mm-hmm. So the question is, God is a God of justice, absolutely. And some people will say, well, God is love, and let's all buy the world a Coke, kind of thing. Like, the justice of God has to be addressed, but the justice of God has been addressed in His Son Jesus Christ, and that's the cross. And so it is that balance between the justice of God and the love of God, but they are met. When I surveyed the Wondrous Cross on which the Prince of or King of Glory died, it says, "See from His hands, His head, His feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down," and that's that intertwining of those things. And I will tell you this: we could definitely grow the church a lot faster if we lifted up a more angry God, because fear is a great motivator. Fear is a great motivator, and you can do that, but that's not the God that I see fully realized. That's yeah, John. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I agree. It's in the experience. It's also in the discernment, in the collectivity of not just what we are experiencing today or what our own life is, but also the experience of others, and kind of yeah, yeah, yep. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a conversation for another time. As much as we want. as much as we want to erect these other things to do our faith for us. Like the church is not going to become more Christian because you put the Ten Commandments in schools or you build monuments to them on that. It's like it's going to become much more when people actually know them and follow them. When people are actually aren't stealing from their neighbor, when they're honoring their mother and father, when they are serious about what preserving life, that kind of thing. So friends, I got to run. So blessings to you all.